read a story, you usually see yourself on the side of the good guys, the protagonist, and not on the antagonist. In other words, you are on the right side, the good side, the side that should win. You are rooting usually for the main characters that you know. You know their story. You are connected with their truth and understanding. You are the heroes in World War II. You are the Avengers. You are that misunderstood hero. Or maybe you're the Jedi. You are definitely not the Nazis, the Death Eaters, evil pirate Davy Jones, or Scar and his angry hyenas. What is great about good storytelling is that you can see and experience something from another perspective, another reality, and be changed in your own reality. So many of the world's best leaders and legacies were avid readers. I read that Warren Buffett reads 500 pages a day. Harry S. Truman said, "Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers." Reading gives people knowledge, and knowledge creates connections that create ways to empower. The average number of books read by a CEO is estimated to be at 60 books per year, based on a survey by Fast Company. That is a lot of reading, a lot of perspectives, and a lot of information. And information is power, and stories are power. Yet many people who have access to stories and books do not read them. The Pew Research released a survey from 2019 that said that 27% of all Americans had not read one book in the last year. In 2011, it was 19%. That's some interesting statistics. And we can look and begin to realize that some people do not have access to books. And we must name those. They don't have access to books in their language, or even a quality library. Books cost money. And money can sometimes be something that people like Warren Buffett can easily afford, while others cannot. And this is one of the reasons we know that the local and school library system is so important. My friend from high school serves a poor school district in Atlanta area, where she was able to give each student a book to take home. She will tell you multiple stories about this one book's impact in the lives of these teenagers. She will share that there were many of those students who shared with her they had never owned something like a book or a story that could be theirs and kept and a part of who they are. So access to books, we know, is an important part of the equation, yet for many of us, time is our excuse to not engage in stories. Most of us listening to this sermon are not the poorest of the poor, without access to books or a library with books in our language. Thus, I began to wonder, is there a correlation between the disconnection and the brokenness in our own society and the rising number of people who are not engaging in stories and reading beyond their own story? I mean, I have heard some people say, I don't want to read, it doesn't matter, the only book I read is the Bible. But I kind of feel like that's doing calculus without taking the steps needed to find the faithful spiritual responses that are in our faith stories. And this is one of the reasons that you'll often hear me recommend a children's storybook Bible sitting next to your adult Bible for book study. Because this is a complex, amazing, deep work of literature. If that's the only story you're reading, you may not be able to understand and put the pieces together. Thus, when engaging with the Bible, I feel like the approach is limited for some people who are not really prepared. They can only approach the stories as childlike, with clear good guys and bad guys. The assumption remains that the person reading the story is on the side of God's chosen people. When we read, we're on the side of the protagonist. And today's story of Rahab is often approached that way. The spies that were sent in by Joshua before the people in the wilderness crossed over the Jordan to reclaim the promised land, we see as the good guys. And we are on their side with those spies. We are cheering for the bravery of Rahab as she hides the spies from the guards in her city and gives them insight on how to overtake Jericho. And yet the book of Joshua continues to be a very difficult one to preach, because it is written in a way where it feels like God takes sides. And while many read this story in a way where we assume we're on the right side with Rahab and the spies, that side of history, I began to wonder and think in a critical way of what happens if we are just the ones who live in Jericho? Think about it. If someone walked up to you right now and told you that their ancestors owned the property you lived on in 1721, and now it's time for you to give it back, would you? I mean, I would probably be on the phone calling my lawyer and getting paperwork together to prove this is mine, this is what I own. Or if someone said we need to at least apologize for taking this land and compensation, which may mean we have to pay money for something that happened 200 years ago, or maybe 100 years ago. What would happen to our community if we had to do something to say sorry for something that happened in 1921? Would you? I've heard people say, well, those things aren't my fault. I wasn't born then. Or, now this is a tough one. I almost took this one out, just thinking somebody's gonna get mad about this, but this is actually how you gotta envision this story. If someone said, you need to go hang out with that drag queen over there because they have been selected by God to help the people who need the apologies and compensation, would you? Because that is exactly how the Jericho community saw Rahab. A prostitute, an outsider, someone who doesn't live in the middle of town but lives on the edges of town. Someone who knew or had to believe that the stories of our faith are connected to the ancestors of our past and connected to our future. But as a society, we are not connected to one another in our present. So it's so difficult to be connected in our present and our past and our future. And Rahab was scared for her future. Her present probably wasn't all that good. As an outlier in Jericho, she was different. So she saw potential in helping these outsiders so that she may ultimately become an insider. And she does. She is said to be one of the great-grandparents of King David. So we must ask, where do we who is God and where is God really working within this story? Would God have treated Jericho differently if Jericho had opened or crumbled their own walls to make room for those who needed a home? Like Nineveh in the story of Jonah, could something different had happened if the people of Jericho said, "Oh, we can change"? What if the spies had not snuck in, but tried at first to go talk to the leaders? Not sneak around, but knock on the door. What are the other outcomes of this story that could have changed it? The story of Rahab and the spies, like many stories in the Bible, is complex and multi-layered and often simplified by our assumptions that we are usually the good guys. But I think most of the time we're just the everyday people. We're not good or bad. We're just hanging out in Jericho or hanging out in the wilderness. We are in the middle of all the things that are happening around us. And often we may not even notice. Yet these are the things that when we aren't paying attention will bring walls crumbling. We saw walls crumble this week and hurt everyday people. And this happens every week in other parts of the world, and we don't even often know it. And we know that there are many people waiting in the wilderness to find home, to find safe and quality places. If we could only hear their stories. If we could only be like Rahab and listen, sometimes by choice, but probably not, by what is being said beyond our stories. If we could let people in that others fear, even if we, like Rahab, are scared. If we can remember that rarely is anyone completely a good person or a bad person, we are all just people with stories and choices. We're all just people who want to be the good guy in our own story and want our lives to matter and be heard. So are you listening? Are you listening faithfully? Can you hear what is happening outside the walls around you? Because the more you know, the more stories you engage in, the more you can be God's love to all people and creation. The more you hear, the more you can change. So when the outsiders come knocking at your door, or you're an outsider knocking at someone else's door, you will be let in. If only the people of Jericho were able to hear the story in a way of love and not in fear, maybe the walls would have crumbled, but without